All right, guys. So here we are with our class once again. And this time we will pick up the mantle of contemporary Christian philosophers, right? Now, what the point of this class, let's do a little bit of overview before we jump right into it. What the point of this particular course is supposed to do is to look at something like an overview of significant thinkers in the current theistic mind frame, specifically the Christian mind frame, right? Well, I shouldn't say mind frame. Obviously, we're going to see that there's different frames of mind. There's going to be different schools of thought. However, what we want to do is look at some of the more prominent thinkers in the again theistic realm, but then specifically the Christian realm here. Now, we're going to try to look at roughly eight or so thinkers. Now, I've got a nice bonus surprise for the last couple of lectures, few lectures, that we will actually be interviewing and talking to some of these thinkers that are making some sort of significant impact culturally, whether it be because they're front and center, or rather, it may be the case that they are behind the curtain, so to speak, playing second violin, right, second fiddle, as the saying goes, in some sense. That they're not necessarily front and center, but they're still making impact. Now, what we want to try to do is when we look at each of these particular thinkers, we want to try to again, this is going to be an overview. We're going to get a lot more in depth in our actual readings. But for sake of lecture, we're going to do an overview so that we get some of the big ideas, the nuts and the bolts of each of these particular thinkers. Now, what we want to try to do, again, we'll look at some of the categories. Will be something like nationality, where are they from? We're going to look at significant ideas and or arguments. We're going to try to look at some of the more popular works, or whether that be text or whether it simply be in some other form. We're going to try to look at if we can pin down what school of thought that they would be labeled under. Because if you've done any sort of apologetic or philosophy of religion study, then you've realized that you may like one particular argument, but you realize that if that argument runs, it doesn't necessarily coincide with this other argument from another popular thinker over here. And so sometimes it's difficult to make sense of that. What do we do with that? Well, a lot of that is going to be because they don't come from the same school of thought. In fact, in regards to my own journey in this, as it pertains to philosophy and theology and even apologetics and whatnot, is that the more that I studied that discipline, but then studied more the nuance of those disciplines, like various arguments, various ways to answer particular objections, I would notice that there seemed to at times be some paradox there, right? And how you would answer one question in regards to another question, and even possibly some contradiction. Now, the danger there is, well, wait a minute. If that answer, if that particular mode doesn't fit here, and in the sense that it's contradictory here, if it's true here, then it can't possibly work over here. Then how am I supposed to make sense of that? And so, in my own journey there, what I started to realize was that it's because I was using one particular argument from one school of thought, and then utilizing another argument that came from a different school of thought in regard to something else. Now, the problem one, aside from the contradiction, or this is what would give rise to the contradiction there, is to reveal the importance of a systematic way to approach problems. I know that in some theological circles, that's a bad word. You don't want to be a systematic theologian or you don't have a systematic philosophy. But that's what it means to be consistent, right? The rise of this whole systematic approach to problems was for the sake of consistency within the worldview, for the sake of logical consistency. among other things, right? There's obviously other things that we could talk about. But one of the primary concerns was, how do we do this in a systematic fashion? That is, how do we do this in a way, a fashion that's coherent, and I don't have to contradict myself, right, when I'm answering one particular question going to another. So this is why that you find um, that in philosophy of religion or even apologetics, there's nothing wrong necessarily with a general approach, but the more in depth you go and the longer you go, you end up having to adopt. It seems like one school of thought in order to stay consistent across the board in how you answer questions. Some of you, that may sound like absolute um, gibberish to you, a foreign language. And there are some of you that are possibly already realizing and putting those pieces together, and you're like, aha, yes, that's it. I see what you're talking about now. So, having said that, let's go ahead and look at one of our first thinkers, right, and the significance here. And that will be none other than the uh, famous William Lane Craig. It seems appropriate that we start this particular course with someone like Craig, simply because of his impact, right? The massive impact that he has had on both apologetics and philosophy, specifically philosophy of religion. Now, let's look at a bit of his background. Right? We're going to go through each one of these. His nationality, again, notable or significant ideas or arguments, notable significant works, notable or significant debates or presentations in the school of thought. Now, someone like Craig, you may be pretty familiar with already, so some of this may seem as just redundant or as nothing, relatively new to give, and that's okay. Now, obviously, well, it may not be obvious to some, but Craig is of the Anglo English speaking world in regards to philosophy, and specifically his nationality is from the United States, right? Now, one of the reasons that's important to point out, among other things, is just because we do know that where you're from does help to shape the way in which you view um, all sorts of topics, right? But then even your philosophical outlook can be shaped by where you're from. Now, of course, we have to be careful as those of us that are interested in philosophy. We don't want to commit the genetic fallacy and say that simply because you are from some particular area, that means that your philosophy is completely determined by that area, right? That would just be completely fallacious to say. Um, but you guys, I'm sure, already know enough about that. Now, let's go ahead and work through some of these. Where could we start in notable or significant ideas and or arguments as given by Craig? Oh my goodness! I mean, he's got so many, right? So the first would be something like the Kalam cosmological argument. Now, though we've stated here that that's a notable or significant idea or argument, um, we do know that that's not. Most of you know that that did not originate with William Lane Craig, right? That originated with, well, it's often said uh, that Avicenna, was the originator of that argument, a Muslim philosopher of the Middle Ages. However, we know that even then it didn't originate there. That he was part of a serious move to clean up and tidy the argument and put it into a rigorous form there. However, it is still notable and significant to Craig because Craig is usually given credit for revitalizing this argument in the modern era. Again, the argument was there, but Craig has been the champion, so to speak, of this sort of cosmological type of argument. Um, as we know, as we've discussed in other philosophy courses and or apologetics courses, there are different types of cosmological arguments. But it is notably Craig, right? It is notably and outstandingly so Craig that just brought this version of the cosmological argument roaring back into the scene, right? The philosophy of religion scene, specifically in regards to debates and presentations. And again, the Kalam cosmological argument. It has to do with a series of causes on a horizontal level, as opposed to a vertical level. causes per accidens, as we would say. And the argument is just simply, unless he's tweaked it up until this point, it's just roughly that everything that it begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, and therefore the universe has a cause. And of course, there he goes on from there to extrapolate what that cause must be like in logical fashion, right? However, even though he did bring this Kalam cosmological even though he did bring this Kalam cosmological argument roaring back into the scene, that's not his only notable idea, right? Argument or contribution to philosophy. Craig is also noted for a few other things. He has been very heavily involved in the philosophy of time, strictly or strongly advocating for and arguing for the A theory of time, as opposed to the B theory of time, right? The A theory being that um, that what's happening right now is literally there's not a past that is still happening in some sense, right? That's not to say that it's not real, but that it's not still just as real, so to speak, as the present is. That's something that did happen, but it's not happening now, right? And the same would go for the future. That's something that will happen, but it's not happening right now. Of course, the B theory of time doesn't deny that what's happening right now is happening right now. It says it is. But in some sense, the B theory of time is that whatever has happened is just as real in the same sense as what is happening right now. And what will happen is just as real. Um, and that's happening just as really in the same sense as what's happening right now, right? In fact, the whole argument there for the B theory is basically that change and time is some sort of illusion in some sense. And so Craig is arguing and has argued extensively for the common sense notion of time, right? The A theory of time, that the present is what's really here right now, and the past was real, but it's not happening, right? And the future will be real, but it's not happening, right? In the same sense that right now is. Um, Craig has also argued for and is also known not only just for the philosophy of time, um, not only for the cosmological argument, but he's also given serious argument to two other things. One, the idea of Molinism, right, which we'll get into, which has to do with possible world semantics, counterfactuals, and things of that nature. But he's also made significant theological contributions in the area specifically of the atonement, right? Arguing very extensively for the penal substitutionary theory of the atonement. And so we'll talk about that one just a little bit first. And of course, we know that that is usually the 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 most advocated for, the most heavily accepted theory of the atonement in evangelical or conservative Christian circles, is that the penal substitutionary theory of the atonement. And Craig has argued very heavily for that particular theory, as opposed to, say, the Victus Christus model, something like that, right? Um, the example model, all these other sorts of models, right? Craig is known for arguing for this substitutionary penal theory of the atonement. Now, Molinism, Craig, at least in theological circles, helped to put this whole idea on the map of God knowing all possible worlds, right? God knowing all possible counterfactuals, and God making decisions based on the free will of man's decision in that specific circumstance which God created, right? So, if you're a libertarian free will advocate, it's not going to be uncommon that you are also an advocate of Molinism. If you want to argue that God is still, in some sense, completely and absolutely in control because he's creating these circumstances, right? But not only is he creating the circumstances in which you find yourself, you have free will in that circumstance. So God knows what you would do, right, in possible world one, possible world two, possible world three, possible world four. God knows, right, what you will do on your own free will, by your own choice, in each and every possible circumstance, right? And so Craig employs this view of Molinism. He's argued for this view of Molinism in regards to salvation, right? How this can account for God being in charge of salvation, how it can account for some being lost. It can account. Craig argues nicely there in those areas. However, he would also say, and again because of Molinism, that this also solves all sorts of problems in regard to why bad things happen, right? Why why evil happens primarily, which we'll bring up again when we talk about another philosopher here about counterfactuals a little bit later in the course. But he would say that it nicely accounts for all of these particular instances of salvation. How can we be free and God be in control of salvation? How can we be free and God be sovereign over situations and circumstances? And Craig points out Molinism here. Now, it doesn't seem to be a stretch that when we talk about his notable or significant works, that they're going to have to do with those categories, right? So Craig does have notable and significant works, right? Book length treatments on the philosophy of time, right? Book length treatments on the idea of Molinism, and of course the Kalam, Cosmological Argument. However, one of his most famous works is going to be his text called Reasonable Faith, right? That's going to be the sometimes given as the standard, the go-to apologetics textbook for those that are trying to give some sort of rational and credible defense for the Christian faith. And this is what it could be argued put Craig on the map, philosophically, intellectually, and in apologetic circles, is this textbook called Reasonable Faith. And of course, this text that he gave was geared towards the non-professional thinker. Notice I combined those words there, non-professional thinker, meaning that you still have to be a thinker, right, to read and get enjoyment out of something like Reasonable Faith. If you're not thinking deeply upon faith and matters of the intellect as they pertain to objections to the Christian worldview and whatnot, then you're not necessarily going to be that inclined to read that textbook. Now, and again, Craig did that on purpose, right? He knew that most that were struggling with these questions of faith and specifically Christian faith, he knew that most of them weren't professional philosophers or academics in some sense, but they had to be in some sense intellectual persons, at least in the sense of that they were thinking about these things and would get something out of this. Now, that book, as most of you are already familiar, gives his Kalam cosmological argument. That's his big existence for or big argument for the existence of God, which would go with another notable idea that we'd mentioned earlier, right? Well, no, I don't think we mentioned it earlier, but here we will, is his moral argument for the existence of God, right? If God doesn't exist, there are no objective moral values and duties, but there are objective moral values and duties, and therefore God exists. So not only is that a notable idea that Craig has given out an argument, but it's also it's part of his most significant works, and that he gives this or argues for this in his book Reasonable Faith. Of course, again, he's done other things like theory of time, Molinism, and has book length treatments on those subjects. But this is his most significant work here is Reasonable Faith. Now, he's also done a couple other books like Hard Questions, Hard Answers. He's contributed heavily to a philosophy text that's essentially can work as a very nice intro to philosophy if you're of that school of thought, Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview. And he co-authored that with another significant Christian thinker called J.P. Moreland. Now, again, when you read that particular book, Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview, that's where you're going to see the last category that will address the school of thought. And that's going to come from, we'll wait till we get to that. But you're going to see a lot of his thinking there systematized in that particular textbook. Now, what might be some notable and or significant debates or presentations that Craig has been a part of? Now, Craig has debated, again, if you follow Craig, which most of you have or do, if you follow Craig, you know that he has been absolutely beastly, right, in his activity regarding debate. Um, there could be so many that are given that we could point towards that would be significant in some sense. But it could be argued that one of his that the most significant time in Craig's life for debate is not during this contemporary period, though he's very active. But it could be argued that the reason he's so active now in this contemporary period is because of these significant debates that took place early on. So Craig famously debated at the time probably the top-notch, most respected atheistic philosopher of religion named Antony Flew. And as a result of that debate, he had a significant debate with other individuals in that same time era. Now, and this would be in the 90s. Now, if you go back and you watch those debates with, say, Flew, or some of there's two others, it's amazing. It's truly amazing that, of the power, the intellectual power that Craig was able to display at those presentations there. Simply because at that particular time, Christians were still Christian thinkers, at least non-academically, just were not really looked at as offering um, anything significant to the field. They were, either antiquated or looked down upon, and in some sense they still are looked down upon. There's no doubt there. But with the arrival of Craig and this debate with Antony Flew, um, and people started to have. It was seen that you were going to have to take this stuff seriously. You were going to have to take this Craig fellow seriously. Um, so, for instance, just to name one for example, when he debated Peter Atkins in the late '90s, Peter Atkins was a very famous, right, British scientist out of Oxford or Cambridge. Um, and Craig, even if it doesn't matter what side of the aisle you're on here, it was just obvious to use very unprofessional language that Craig just wiped the floor with Peter Atkins. Peter Atkins was just not prepared to engage with William Lane Craig's philosophical ideas and arguments. And not only was he not prepared to interact with Craig's positive affirmations of, say, arguments for the existence of God, but he just wasn't prepared for Craig's rebuttals of his own arguments that Atkins himself had argued. In fact, Craig famously said during that debate um, that Atkins' answers and responses sounded like pop metaphysics. And to say that at a debate and it actually carries substantial weight behind it, as opposed to just a mere, sarcastic remark or mocking type remark, but it actually had substantial weight behind it, was huge. So just that would be one, for example, the Antony Flew debate. But then also too, if you go check out the debate he has with Peter Atkins, that just was a very significant swing in the whole apologetics or even possibly philosophy of religion endeavor there. That Christians all of a sudden had to be taken very, very, very seriously for those in the know, right? Now, school of thought. Most of our philosophers here that we discuss are going to come from this same school of thought, and that's going to be obviously Christian theism, right? So you can check that off for the Captain Obvious remark there. However, they're going to come from a school of thought which would be called analytic philosophy, specifically this modern notion, this contemporary notion of modern analytic philosophy. Now, modern analytic philosophy, and I won't have to say this every time that we go through this because you'll have gotten at least some of it here in this lecture. But modern analytic philosophy, ironically, prides itself on not being from a particular school of thought. So we can compare this with something like Cartesians, right? People that would follow in the vein of Descartes, or Thomists, right? Those that would follow in the vein of someone like Thomas Aquinas, or Aristotelians who would follow in the vein of Aristotle. And in fact, you have what are called Aristotelian Thomists, right? They're in that particular school of thought. Um, Also, this would be different from, say, someone that was Platonic or Neoplatonic, right? Like St. Augustine came from the school of thought of can sometimes be argued to be Neoplatonic in his understanding of metaphysics and all these sorts of things, right? Now, and you've got continental philosophy. Now, modern analytic philosophy is supposed to be, at least in theory, it's supposed to basically say something like this: Look, I'm not necessarily from some particular school of thought. You just bring your argument, and we just evaluate the argument on its own merits, right? Now, the point of this class is not to go into whether or not that's valid, right? Whether or not that really works. It's the point is not to go into, well, can you really just say, with no metaphysical baggage that you're already assuming, or principles that you're already carrying into the game, can you really just say, I don't have a school of thought that I'm coming from. I'm not systematized in that fashion. Well, what are your arguments? Let's just gauge your arguments on their own merit. Again, the point of the class isn't to argue whether or not that's possible, but at least in principle, that's something like what modern analytic philosophy is supposed to be about. Is that it's not necessarily some rigorously systematized school. It's just, let's look at the arguments and gauge them on their own merit. Now, I think that that's an admirable, statement. I'm just not sure if that works out in theory. But again, that's neither here nor there for the purposes of this class. But Craig would be from if we had to try to put him into some category, a modern analytic philosopher. Now, if we were to go back over these, right, nationality, notable significant ideas and or arguments, notable and or significant works, notable significant debates, you could see how, especially if you're familiar with the modern analytic school, how that thought pattern, right, how that system is going to play into his ideas and or arguments, how that's going to play into Craig's works, right, and how that's going to play into even how he approaches debate, right. And in fact, if you've had a history of philosophy course prior to this, then you'll start to see how that really does impact those sorts of things, and you start to see why and how those answers are going to be more or less consistent with one another, depending on school of thought. However, we will save that for our next class. Hopefully, we're going to try to keep these so that you can get most of the bulk of your substantial stuff in your textbook readings. But again, we're going to try to go through an overview of each of these thinkers. And so we're going to try to keep these pretty short, pretty succinct, and to the point. So that's our first class. That's our first discussion. First lecture is over William Lane Craig. Hopefully, we will see you very soon.